In 1962, 4 men were sent to a deserted island to record the weather. Within weeks, their radio began receiving transmissions from a frequency that didn't exist. When they investigated, they discovered 3 centuries of shipwreck survivors, different countries, different languages, different eras, all describing the exact same sound coming from the water. Someone counting. The government reviewed the evidence, closed the file, and labeled it no action required. One man made recordings before he left. His daughter found them after he died. She played the tape once and never touched it again. The Canadian government called it a weather posting. The 4 men who accepted it called it boring. Routine. A year of recording wind speeds, barometric pressure, and wave heights on a 40-kilometer ribbon of sand in the North Atlantic, 300 kilometers off the coast of Nova Scotia. Nobody came to Sable Island for adventure. You came because the pay was steady, the isolation was manageable, and the work required just enough attention to prevent boredom from becoming something clinical. That was the general understanding in the autumn of 1962. The general understanding was wrong in ways that took 11 months to fully reveal themselves. Sable Island does not look like a place capable of holding secrets. It looks like a mistake. A crescent of sand so low and narrow that standing at its center, you can see ocean on both sides simultaneously, as if the land itself hasn't fully committed to existing. It is featureless in the way that only places shaped entirely by wind and current can be featureless. No rock, no elevation, no fixed point the eye can rest on. The sand shifts continuously. The island that exists today is measurably different from the island that existed 50 years ago, the eastern tip eroding, the western tip extending, the whole structure migrating slowly across the ocean floor like something with a destination. What Sable Island has instead of geography is history, specifically the history of ships. For 3 centuries, the sandbanks extending from its shores have been pulling vessels down with the indifferent efficiency of a machine built for a single purpose. Over 350 wrecks by conservative count. The sandbanks are nearly invisible, lying just below the surface in water that looks open and navigable until a hull touches bottom and the Atlantic does the rest. Sailors once called it the graveyard of the Atlantic, a name that sounds dramatic until you understand it is simply accurate. The bones of ships and the bones of sailors are both down there, layered in the sand beneath the waves, pressed together without distinction. The lighthouse station had operated on the island since 1801. By 1962, its function had evolved from navigation to weather observation, a posting that cycled staff in and out on annual rotations. The island's permanent population was 4. The station chief, 2 junior meteorologists, and a maintenance engineer. A supply boat came quarterly. A radio maintained contact with the mainland. The 4 men who arrived in September 1962 were Douglas, the station chief, a methodical man of 44 who had spent 2 decades in remote postings and appeared to have made peace with solitude the way some men make peace with a chronic injury. Not happily, but functionally. Martin and Gerald were the junior meteorologists, both in their late 20s, both treating the posting as a credential to be survived and then displayed on a resume. The 4th man was Erickson, the maintenance engineer, a taciturn Norwegian-Canadian who spoke so rarely that the others sometimes forgot to account for his opinions until he offered them, bluntly, at moments of maximum inconvenience. They settled into the station's rhythms by October. Observations at 6-hour intervals. Maintenance rotations. Meals at fixed times. The small democracy of shared confinement that governs all isolated postings. Whose turn to cook, who left the equipment room unlocked, the careful negotiations of private space in a building that offered very little of it. The wild horses were the one thing nobody had prepared them for emotionally. Sable Island's horses are descended from animals brought by settlers in the 18th century and have lived on the island without human management for so long they have become something separate from domesticated horses. Not wild exactly, but independent in a way that domesticated animals never achieve. They move across the sand in small groups, grazing on the maram grass, standing in the surf during summer. In autumn, with the station staff newly arrived and the horses completing their own seasonal adjustments, The animals came close to the buildings with a familiarity that unsettled the new arrivals. They would stand outside the windows at dusk, watching, not asking for anything, not retreating when approached, simply present. Gerald wrote to his wife in October that the horses were the strangest thing about the island. He would revise that assessment significantly by spring. The first anomaly appeared in November, logged by Douglas with the neutral precision of a man trained to record what he observes without editorializing. The barometric readings were wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not wrong in a way that would alarm someone reviewing the logs from the mainland. Wrong in the way that a clock is wrong when it loses 3 minutes a day. A discrepancy small enough to be attributed to instrument drift, large enough to bother someone who understood what the instruments were measuring. The pressure readings from the island station diverged from the readings at the mainland station in a pattern that Douglas couldn't attribute to weather differential. The island was showing pressure that should have corresponded to conditions the island wasn't experiencing. Calm surface readings with pressure numbers suggesting a storm that wasn't there. Douglas recalibrated. The divergence continued. He noted it in the station log, flagged it in his weekly transmission to Halifax, and received back the meteorological equivalent of a shrug. Check your equipment, resubmit, we'll review. He checked the equipment. He resubmitted. The divergence continued. By December, Martin had noticed something separate that he was reluctant to report officially, and so reported instead to Douglas verbally, standing in the equipment room with the particular discomfort of someone raising a subject they know sounds irrational. The radio, he said, was receiving transmissions during the early morning hours, between 2 and 4 a.m. specifically, that didn't correspond to any known frequency or station. Not noise exactly, not static. Martin, who had been trained in radio operation and understood the difference between interference and signal, described it as signal with the specific quality of intent, rhythm and variation, pattern without decipherability. Douglas listened, asked the relevant questions, asked Martin to record the next occurrence. Martin recorded 7 occurrences between December and February. Each recording was submitted to Halifax. Halifax's technical team identified 2 of them as probable atmospheric skip, a phenomenon where radio signals bounce off the ionosphere and arrive from unexpected directions. The other 5 they classified as unexplained and filed accordingly, which is the bureaucratic equivalent of turning a light off in a room you don't want to enter. Erickson, who had been silent on all of this, said exactly one thing about the recordings in February. He said, "It sounds like someone counting." Nobody asked him to elaborate. In the silence of the equipment room, with the Atlantic pressing against the windows, elaboration felt unnecessary and somehow dangerous. Winter on Sable Island is less about cold than about reduction. The island strips away layers. There is no town beyond the horizon to drive to, no cinema, no pub, no accumulation of other lives to dilute your awareness of your own. You are left with yourself and with 3 other men, and with the sand and the horses and the ocean on both sides. By February, the men had exhausted their supply of small talk and entered the more honest territory of long silence and direct exchange. They knew each other's habits with the intimacy of family and the limited affection of colleagues. They ate together, worked together, spent their evenings in the same room reading different books, occasionally sharing sentences that had struck them, a form of conversation that required no response. It was during one of these evenings in February that Gerald looked up from his book and said, "I think the island remembers the ships." Nobody asked him what he meant. They understood what he meant. They had all felt it. The specific texture of Sable Island silence, which was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of accumulation. 3 centuries of ships pulled down. 3 centuries of men who had stood on decks and seen the sandbanks rising beneath them with no time left to alter course. The island's sand held all of it without ceremony or memorial. You walked the beach and felt it underfoot. Not literally, not a sensation, but as knowledge your body arrived at independent of your reasoning. The horses stood outside the window that evening in a line, watching. March brought the incident that divided the year into before and after. Douglas had been conducting the 2 a.m. observation, barometric reading wind speed, wave height, log in the station's official record when he saw the light on the water. Not the light from the lighthouse, which he knew the direction and character of precisely. Something on the surface, approximately 2 kilometers northeast, moving in a pattern that suggested neither vessel nor natural phenomenon. He watched it for 11 minutes, timed exactly, because Douglas was the kind of man who timed exactly. It did not approach. It did not recede. It moved in a pattern he later described in the station log as purposeful but not navigational. Then it was gone. He reported it. The mainland suggested a fishing vessel with unusual lighting. There were no fishing vessels registered in that area on that date. Douglas had already checked before filing his report, because Douglas was also the kind of man who checked. Martin's recordings from that night contained something different from the previous transmissions. Not counting or whatever Erickson had heard as counting. Something that Martin, in his notes, could only describe as responsive, as if the signal that had been arriving for months had registered the lighthouse's presence, or Douglas's observation, or something about that particular night, and altered accordingly. Gerald said nothing for 2 days after Douglas told him what he'd seen. On the 3rd day, he said, "I've been reading about the wrecks." He had a book, one he'd brought from the mainland for reasons he couldn't fully explain, a detailed history of Sable Island's maritime disasters. He had been reading it since December, he said, systematically, beginning to end. He had gotten to the wreck of the Francis, 1799, a vessel carrying settlers from St. Pierre, 163 people, of whom 8 survived, when he noticed something he needed to show them. The survivors of the Francis, according to the account, had been found on the eastern beach by the island's then-resident keeper. They described, in testimony recorded at the time, hearing a sound from the direction of the sandbanks in the hours after the wreck. Not the sounds of the ship breaking up, which they could distinguish from this. Something separate, something they could only describe, in the translated testimony, as counting. Erickson read the passage, set the book down, put on his coat, and went outside, and they could see him through the window, standing on the sand with the horses around him in the dark for a long time. April's supply boat brought provisions, mail, and a junior technician from Halifax dispatched to examine the radio equipment. The technician spent 3 days running diagnostics, replaced a component he described as worn, and declared the system within normal operating parameters. He took Martin's recordings back to Halifax for further analysis. His report, filed 6 weeks later, classified the recordings as atmospheric phenomena of an unusual but not unprecedented type. The file was closed. Martin read the report and said nothing. Gerald read the report and said, "They didn't listen to all of them." He knew this because he had made copies. He had played the copies enough times to know that the last 2 recordings, the ones from the night Douglas saw the light on the water, were different in a way the report did not address. Either because the technician had not listened that far, because he had listened and chosen the atmospheric phenomena classification deliberately, the way you choose a door when you don't want to know what's behind it. Douglas, who had spent 20 years as a government employee and understood the grammar of official reports, read the classification and added a single line to the station log. Mainland review complete. Local observation continues. The summer was almost normal. The readings stabilized or appeared to stabilize. The early morning transmissions reduced in frequency. The horses moved to the western end of the island, as they apparently did every summer, and their absence from the station windows returned the evenings to something more closely resembling ordinary. The men completed their work. Their correspondence with the mainland resumed its previous rhythms. Routine reports, supply requests, the administrative small talk of a posting moving toward its end. Gerald finished his book about the wrecks in July. He didn't discuss it. He left it in the common room, and each of the other men read parts of it without mentioning they'd done so. A collective decision arrived at without consultation. What Gerald had found, and what the others found when they read the relevant sections, was a pattern. Across 3 centuries of wreck accounts, among the testimonies of survivors who had been on Sable Island long enough to give depositions before being returned to the mainland, the word counting appeared 7 times. In different languages, in testimonies separated by decades. Survivors of ships with no connection to each other, arriving on different shores of the island in different centuries, describing the same sound from the direction of the sandbanks. 7 testimonies, separated by time, language, culture, circumstance, united by one word. The station log from August is the most sparsely written of the year. Douglas, normally meticulous, reduced his personal entries to measurements and maintenance records. What he was thinking is not recorded. What the 4 men discussed in those last weeks before rotation can only be inferred from what each of them did afterward. The relief crew arrived in September 1963. The 4 men departed with the supply boat, standing on the deck as Sable Island's low profile sank below the horizon. The same view the Francis survivors had when they left in 1799, the same view every outgoing crew had experienced since the station was established. The island did not look capable of holding anything. It looked like sand and wind and nothing more. Gerald submitted his own informal report to a colleague at Dalhousie University in November 1963, a document that was never officially filed but survived in the colleague's personal papers and was discovered during an estate review in 1991. In it, Gerald described the year's anomalies comprehensively and without the distancing language of official classification. His conclusion was not dramatic. It was quieter than dramatic, which made it more difficult to set aside. He wrote, "Sable Island has been receiving signals for longer than we have been sending them. I do not think the source is atmospheric. I think it is geological or historical or something that does not have a category in the framework I was trained to use. I think it counts the ships. I think it has been counting since before there were instruments to measure what it does. I think what we heard in the early mornings was the island updating its record. I cannot explain the light Douglas saw. I cannot explain why the count sounds patient rather than mechanical. I can only say that after 11 months on that island, I am certain of one thing. Sable Island is not waiting for the next wreck. It has already accounted for them. The document ends there." Gerald returned to a university career. He published extensively on meteorological instrumentation and is cited respectfully in his field. He never returned to Sable Island and never publicly discussed the posting beyond the official station log. Martin kept his copies of the recordings. His daughter, sorting his belongings after his death in 2004, found a cassette tape labeled in his handwriting with a single word, April. She played it once. She has not played it again. She has not thrown it away. Sable Island is a national park reserve now. The horses are protected. Researchers come to study the sand's migration, the horse's behavior, the ecology of a place that shouldn't sustain life but does, stubbornly, on its own terms. The old weather station buildings are still there, weathered to the color of driftwood, listing slightly in the direction of the prevailing wind. The sandbanks haven't changed. The ships are still down there. And in the Maritime Archives in Halifax, in a folder marked Technical Anomalies, reviewed, no action required, there are recordings from the winter of 1962 to 1963 that the technician's report addressed only partially. The ones he didn't address are still in the folder. Nobody has formally requested them. The island, for its part, hasn't stopped transmitting. It never needed anyone to listen. It only needed someone to finally understand that it wasn't calling out. It was keeping count.